Okay, well, first, let me just thank you all so much for joining this virtual talk. And I want to extend my gratitude first to the British Sociological Association Food Studies Group, especially Professor Julie Parsons for inviting me and helping to make arrangements. It's really a privilege to be part of a series of talks alongside the likes of Professors Emily Contois, Sarah Bowen, and Ashante Reese. And obviously, I wish we could all be together and look forward to when we can start doing these kinds of events in person. But what I really love about this opportunity is that we can engage in this virtual space across all of our different locations across the UK and across the world. So thank you all for being here today. So today I'll be talking about food and gentrification and the prospects for food justice in our highly unequal cities. I'll draw on some of my work alongside Professors Alison Alcon and Yuki Kato in our edited volume, A Recipe for Gentrification, Food, Power, and Resistance in the City, which was a collective effort entailing the insights and passion of 22 authors. But I'll also discuss some of my research in Denver, Colorado. And then I'll unpack the stakes of food's role in displacing poor people and people of color from their neighborhoods, and the reason why food is a significant site for struggles against gentrification. And then I'll conclude with some suggestions about how to use food as a means for ensuring long-term residents' ability to stay in place. But first, what is gentrification? So the term emerges in the context of 1960s London. Ruth Glass, a sociologist, was observing how the gentry, which was understood in Britain at that time as wealthier classes below that of the nobility, were gentrifying neighborhoods. So while the specifics of gentrification continue to be debated, there are some important broader points to consider that are in line with Glass's original formulation. So very simply, gentrification is the process by which a neighborhood experiences disinvestment and economic decline, followed by what's oftentimes referred to as revitalization and redevelopment. So capital and wealthier people move in and renovate or rebuild the housing and retail stock. This then increases property values, changes community culture, and leads to the displacement of low-income residents. In the US and in many places around the world, this process is also racialized, meaning that often white, wealthier people displace low-income people of color. But going deeper for just a moment, there are two long-standing explanations for why gentrification takes place. So the political economy argument is based in the thesis of the rent gap. And this is really simply the idea that there is a gap between the prevailing and potential market rate for property. Sociologists and geographers have long understood that cities have what sociologist Harvey Malech refers to as growth machines. And these are made up of political and economic elites. So people like planners, politicians, real estate brokers, and developers who find ways to commodify land to increase economic growth. So in short, development interests come up with strategies to make profit through real estate by appealing to wealthier people. Conversely, the cultural approach focuses on the role of aesthetics and tastes of what Richard Florida called the creative class, or more recently, what we might just call hipsters. As cities become more post-industrial and led by artistic-minded professionals in, say, service and knowledge-based occupations, they become more attractive to move to. And cities are attractive to gentrifiers as countercultural spaces that have urban aesthetics, what we might refer to as cool or green amenities, a perceived opportunity for authentic living, more liberated forms of self-expression, and diversity that is tolerant of historically marginalized groups. So going back to food for a moment and for the rest of this talk, you can now take a dive into any social media portal, type in hashtag food gentrification, and especially after Black feminist writer Mikki Kendall's viral tweets and article about the co-option and upscaling of Black cultural foods like kale, and find intense debate over many intersecting topics: cultural appropriation, poverty, housing, food access, and racism, just to name a few, although there's obviously more, vie for discursive influence. After all, cities have become these battlegrounds. And really the contest, I think, is over who has a right to the city and what, if anything, is to be done about gentrification. So one of the first inklings of the current cultural debates over food gentrification, especially here in the United States, might have been on the widely read satirical blog started by Christian Lander and Miles Valentin called Stuff White People Like. As one might guess, food-related topics were really central. In a particularly telling post, number 45, Asian Fusion Food, the blog states, "While white people enjoy venturing to ethnic parts of town to satisfy their palate, most would prefer to take their first dates and parents to a place with dimmer lights, less water tanks with crabs and lobsters wishing that they would die, less ducks hanging from the window and tablecloths that aren't plastic sheets. Some people caught on to this and decided to open Asian fusion restaurants. These people are now very rich." And then there is the post number 43, Gentrification, 73, Gentrification, which claims, in general, white people love situations where they can't lose. While this accounts for the majority of their situations, perhaps the safest bet a white person can make is to buy a house in an up-and-coming neighborhood. White people like to live in these neighborhoods because they get credibility and respect from other white people for living in more authentic neighborhoods where they are exposed to true culture every day. So what makes these observations particularly cutting is that the blog targeted typical white, educated, and/or well-meaning liberals with upward class mobility, which are the same groups that often drive gentrification around the world. So taken together, there is an economic and a cultural dimension to how omnivorous tastes and economic advantage position such eaters to colonize the tastes in places historically occupied by low-income people and people of color. But, and this is something I want to spend a bit of time on, the following three anecdotes that I want to read that open a recipe for gentrification suggests the intersections between food and gentrification are many. And there is more endangered than gentrifying food itself. Indeed, food is an economic and cultural anchor that can further displacement, but also has the potential, albeit the pitfalls are many, to be a source for shoring up the means for urban economic survival and human flourishing. Moreover, food puts the prominent explanations for gentrification into a more nuanced and dynamic conversation, which I think is really important when thinking through what is gentrification. So let me offer some more specifics. The sign was intended to be ironic, a joke even, but the community was not laughing. On one side, it read, "Ink Coffee, happily gentrifying the neighborhood since 2014. The other proclaimed, "Nothing says gentrification like being able to order a cortado." The neighborhood is Denver's 5 Points, long home, not always by choice, to much of the city's Black residents. In a history common to many Black communities across the United States, residents were prevented from living in other parts of the city through segregation, redlining, and racial covenants. The neighborhood became a vibrant cultural center, colloquially known as the Harlem of the West, where more than 50 jazz clubs hosted many of the early 20th century's most well-known performers. But 5 Points is no longer predominantly Black, as gentrification has brought an influx of younger, whiter, and wealthier residents. Indeed, realtors and developers no longer even refer to 5 Points at all, but as the River North Arts District, or RINO, a common strategy to abbreviate neighborhoods and gentrifying neighborhoods around the world. And these new residents patronize the area's many new galleries, restaurants, breweries, and cafes like Ink Coffee. The sign became a flashpoint for political organizing. Community members understood, sometimes viscerally, that gentrification just doesn't mean cleaning up the neighborhood. It also means, in the words of community organizer Lisa Calderon, pushing us out of our community. Although most activists did not engage in property damage, someone spray painted white coffee across the building, unsteadily gesturing at the racialized nature of food's place in urban revitalization. The coffee shop's window was also broken, and an unnamed skateboarder stole the offensive sign. So these incidents, along with the ongoing protest, forced the business to close for several days, cost them a valuable contract with University of Colorado, Denver, and sparked broader organizing against gentrification, including one lifelong resident and activist's successful campaign to replace the current city council member. New Orleans is not cosmopolitan. There's no kale here. With these words reported in the New York Times in 2014, Dutch actress Tara Elders set off the social media controversy that came to be known as Kalegate. The quote appeared in an article that followed some of the city's new bohemian residents as they engaged with the city's varied cultural scenes. And then there was the barrage of think pieces, tweets, and hashtags. Times-Picayune reporter Jarvis DeBerry opened his scathing response with a description of the iconic restaurant Dookie Chase's Gumbo Zerbs, which is traditionally served on Holy Thursday and consisting of no less than 9 greens, kale included. He called for New Orleanians to email or tweet photos of the many places kale was available within the city, and hundreds responded. Johanna Gilligan, the director of Grow Dat Youth Farm, observed that people are buying kale at the market with a new sense of pride. Local restaurants and farmers markets offer Kalegate specials, and Eater, an online food magazine with a site for most major cities, constructed an interactive map showcasing restaurants where the green was available. In the words of Grist Magazine's Heather Hansman, "You can insult New Orleans, but if you talk bad about its greens, the locals get up in arms." You see, Kalegate angered so many New Orleanians because it represented this pervasive sense that the power to define and represent the city lies not with its long-term residents, but with the newcomers. And these newcomers, like many before them, romanticize a view of the city that celebrates a sense of magic and mysticism, while eliding the legacies of colonialism, slavery and struggle, and of deluge and drowning that continue to shape residents' everyday lives. The exceptionalist narrative casts New Orleanians as wild spirits, too busy costuming and drinking to address social ills, leaving the city to sink, perhaps literally, into a sort of languid decline. But countering this romanticized view, local writers used Kalegate to offer a glimpse into New Orleans' complex histories and cultures, including struggles for civil rights, workers' rights, and food justice, and to proclaim their own sense of a place in a city that they are struggling to define. The table runs an entire West Oakland city block and seats 500. This diverse group of diners has been brought together by the People's Kitchen Collective, a trio of activists, artists, storytellers, chefs. The meal was the final installment of a 4-part series, from the farm to the kitchen to the table to the streets. A critique of the farm-to-table movement, which, according to PKC, too often ignores the contributions of people of color. These meals centered on the recipes and stories of diverse communities. Streets was a public meal and protest piece designed to celebrate shared resilience in the face of rapid gentrification and displacement. According to the collective, this is a reclaiming of the commons, of the streets that are rapidly being disconnected from their history through gentrification. Here, we'll eat publicly at the intersection of food, art, and justice. We also meet at the intersection of Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X's birthdays, and at 28th Street and Magnolia Street, the site of Black Panther Lil Bobby Hutton's murder by the police 50 years ago. We deliberately create and take up space while focusing on building health and connection. In the face of gentrifying Oakland, this is how we feed a revolution. The community began the meal with locally gathered yerba buena and rosehip tea offered by Cafe Alone, which features and promotes local indigenous foods. The collective then offered Japanese pickles to represent the community uprooted from the neighborhood during World War II. The main course of pulled chicken, beans, cornbread, and collard greens paid homage to the Black Panther Party's free breakfast for school children program, which began in this neighborhood. Jocelyn Jackson, a collective co-founder, describes West Oakland as the perfect place to speak to gentrification. On the blocks, we're setting tables, people are being displaced. Even if transition is happening, it's important to claim the space as home. Attendees were encouraged to support Donald Foster, a longtime journalist and community activist who's being evicted from the street where the event took place. So as these anecdotes from the introduction to A Recipe for Gentrification suggest, exploring food offers a really visceral opportunity to move beyond the scholarly focus on residential growth and displacement to understand how urban development affects the economic, cultural, and ecological dimensions of place. It also helps bring together theories of the production of urban space, which view gentrification as a structural process fostered by capitalist urbanization, together with those that analyze culture and consumption through taste, cultural foods, and cultural capital. See, often structural investment in new food spaces and individual consumers' tastes interact to intensify the transformation of gentrifying neighborhoods. Therefore, food trends and food activism serve as this really ideal, tangible focal point for examining how the process unfolds. A healthy supermarket's establishment in a neighborhood that previously lacked access to fresh food could be an initiator of gentrification rather than an attempt to expand neighborhood food security, in a process oftentimes referred to as greenlining. Or, while historically urban gardens have served as a place for low-income people of color to grow food that supplements their pantry, reminds them of home, and provides a place for ethno-racial or neighborhood solidarity, as urban agriculture has gained in popularity, it's often embraced to promote environmental sustainability to attract newcomers. So it's this latter example of urban agriculture's role in gentrification and the possibility for using urban agriculture as a site for resistance that I'm going to detail much further with an example from Denver, Colorado, a case I've studied extensively and a city I've spent much time in. So in 2009, Mayor John Hickenlooper declared May 14th Grow Local Colorado Day. And notably, the city backed an edible public demonstration garden at Civic Center Park, which is the political heart of Colorado in the city of Denver. And then in 2010, Mayor Hickenlooper formed the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council as part of this much larger trend, especially in the United States and Canada, of food policy councils. And then, elected in 2011, Mayor Michael Hancock continued and expanded these efforts. And under his leadership, Denver's 2020 sustainability goals proposed to grow and process at least 20% of the city's food from the state of Colorado, combat climate change, decrease obesity, reduce waste, and provide workforce training to support Denver employers. And for a lot of Denver urban farmers, they were under the impression that that goal meant that a bunch of food was going to be produced in the city of Denver itself. But as a Denver reporter for the commercial real estate digital media company BizNow put it in a very telling headline about how sustainability operates via local food and urban agriculture, way to grow. Urban farms are an amenity at many developments. And so what this all suggests, and what I'm going to get into a bit more, is that political economy can animate conditions that make it possible for the cultural significance of urban agriculture to revalorize disinvested neighborhoods and induce displacement. So to understand what's been taking place in Denver and in many cities in the US, Canada, and Europe, it's important to understand the role food has played in the context of the Great Recession and its aftermath. So in Denver, between 2006 to 2010, about 30,000 homes went into foreclosure. For comparison, roughly 700 homes went into foreclosure in 2016 after the recovery period. So this stripped many working class communities and communities of color of a major asset and set them at an economic disadvantage compared to white communities. Across cities in the Mountain West, Black and Latinx residents experienced the highest foreclosure risks. Additionally, these same people continue to struggle economically. Black and Latinx people had higher unemployment rates and poverty than white people when comparing 2000 to the 2010 to 2014 recovery period. And yet, years after the official recovery from the Great Recession, the neighborhoods with the highest concentrations of poverty and people of color, which are the same neighborhoods that were redlined between the 1940s and the 1960s, were vulnerable to or experiencing gentrification. Not only were housing prices increasing, but the class and ethno-racial mix included far wealthier and more white people. So instead of mobilizing public resources to ameliorate these conditions, the city opted to court young professionals hip to the cultural appeal of local food and urban agriculture. See, the problem for urban agriculture and local food advocates is that political support is often entangled in neoliberal policy priorities built on histories of racial segregation. As a mayoral candidate, Michael Hancock laid out an economic development plan to entice well-educated people to move to Denver. As marketer in chief, he promised to aggressively market Denver to recruit new businesses to elevate Denver's brand as a business-friendly city with the highest quality of life. And partially as a result, Denver is unaffordable for many working class people and people of color. And moreover, most affordable housing developments are integrated into mixed use developments with more market rate housing. So according to an inclusionary housing ordinance, which in theory was meant to increase affordable housing, and this was pushed by Mayor Hancock, only 10% of units must meet affordable housing statutes. So just mathematically, gentrification in these neighborhoods is therefore highly likely. And under this scenario, urban farmers became squeezed between being able to access what's often referred to as underutilized land after the Great Recession, the popularity of and political support for local food, their precarity once housing prices skyrocketed, and that their work is not considered what's often referred to as highest and best use of land. And to put this in perspective, according to a recent study by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, Denver saw more widespread gentrification than any other US metro area except San Francisco between 2013 and 2017. So the experience of the Urban Farmers Collaborative is especially illustrative. For 5 years, beginning in 2010, a group of farmers, one nonprofit and two for-profits, farmed the 3-acre sustainability park. After their lease expired, they had to find a new location. The farm was located in Curtis Park, and this is part of 5 Points, which I described earlier. Since 2000, the demographics have flipped from majority people of color to majority white. In 2000, the neighborhood was 42% Latinx, 26% Black, and 27% white. But in 2015, white people accounted for 64% of the population, while the Latinx and Black population shrunk to 20 and 10% respectively. Moreover, the inflation-adjusted average household income was $49,000 in 2000 and almost doubled in 2015 to $81,000. So while the Urban Farmers Collaborative had less economic and political power than developers, their social and cultural capital as white and highly educated people that were engaged in a popular practice allowed them to access land even if it was only for a short time, in this case, 5 years. But they held more economic and cultural power than some working class residents facing displacement. And this enabled them to become a force for gentrification in the context of development interests that were looking for up and coming neighborhoods. See, the Sustainability Park farm sat on Denver Housing Authority land. And this was a historic site of affordable housing going back to the 1930s. See, DHA is a quasi-municipal corporation that is subject to local housing laws and city and federal oversight. And in theory, its mission is to support affordable housing. However, exploiting the weaknesses of the inclusionary housing ordinance, it decided to land bank the property until the housing market was strong. And they did that by leasing it to these farmers. See, Sustainability Park was planned by DHA to revalorize the land. As journalist Scott McFetrig sanguinely commented, during the Great Recession, downtown landowners and leaders offered up plots for free to get new vitality on empty streets. But with many people clamoring to live in downtown Denver, new housing development is far more profitable than farms. So this land was eventually sold and became the Spark Condo and Townhome Project. Seizing the opportunity to co-opt the work of the Urban Farmers Collaborative, Spark's website claims sustainability is the ethos for the project, and that the development is celebrating the spirit of urban community and farming. And despite claims that the development creates affordable housing, this project furthers gentrification. Out of the 41 units in the first phase of development, only 5 were under $350,000. And this was for the base model, studios between 5 and 600 square feet. 5 to 10 years prior to this development, that same money would buy up to 4 times that square footage directly across the street. No long-standing for-profit urban farmer or urban agriculture nonprofit is part of Spark. Instead, the capital flush Altius Farms, Inc. has a large vertical farming greenhouse dedicated to growing greens for local restaurants, with a smaller percentage sold through a CSA to increasingly wealthy local residents. As the CEO, Sally Herbert, put it before starting operations, "I'm inspired by the Spark sustainable, innovative development. Altius Farms is excited and eager to continue the long history of farming at this neighborhood location." While local food and farming frames dominate the public materials of Spark, the approach suggests that capital-intensive, patented, high-tech vertical aeroponics farming is the preferred path forward for growing food in cities. As Jeff Olson, who is a co-founder of Altius Farms, claimed in a radio interview, a farmer growing high-value greens with vertical aeroponics technology could make $250,000 per acre per harvest in a system that can have 10 harvests a year. He then sidestepped the issue of inequity in who can afford this food, or for that matter, who could afford to start such operations, by claiming that it is necessary to first begin with, quote, early adopters of local food who are, quote, conscious and into this. So the co-option of urban agriculture by Spark has intensified gentrification in Curtis Park. And the wealthier white people who now live here can purchase cortados from places like Ink Coffee, which I described earlier. They can also go to Uchi, the sushi restaurant started by James Beard award-winning chef Tyson Cole, an Austin, Texas success that branched out to Denver. It is located at Spark, right below Altius Farms. As Cole remarked, we are always exploring new avenues to expand how we connect with food in the community. Uchi's proximity to the greenhouse space above the restaurant and the community garden at Spark presents an amazing opportunity. But I would ask, what community? Is it the omnivorous one that will spend $100 a person on a 10-course omakase tasting? So what's to be done? For me, and for a lot of food justice scholars and activists, food justice is the fight for social justice throughout the entire food system. And if we understand the food system to be a system of systems, then this means it's a fight that extends into economic, political, cultural, social, and ecological life. So when I think of advancing food justice as it pertains to gentrification, it is critical to be mindful of how the seemingly useful creation of a garden or a farm-to-table restaurant that supports local farmers and sells environmentally sustainable products takes place in context of racial capitalism. Urbanization creates spaces that advance the power of rich and white people. Controlling food and food spaces in cities is no different. If people are committed to food justice, it makes sense that they would be committed to anti-gentrification struggles that also work to advance economic and racial justice. One of the shared human conditions is the need to eat to survive. But I think more importantly than that are the cultural foods we have developed. And these foods tie us to land and place. We watch plants grow, we smell their fragrances, and we turn them into recipes that nourish our bodies and social bonds. While our cultural foods may vary, there are common conditions that provide meaning to life. And at the same time, globally, more people work with food than anything else. This could be from growing crops to preparing and serving meals in a restaurant or at home. The point being, we have already organized society to nourish each other. Food creates and represents deep social bonds. But food is also a site of incredible division and violence. And this shared suffering for many people, whether it's the experience of hunger, displacement from ancestral farming, foraging, and hunting grounds, exploitation at work, or the stripping of control of urban food landscapes, suggests that food is a frontline social justice struggle. And if we agree, then food is an entry point into thinking about how we can create more just and regenerative systems than capitalism, racism, colonialism, and patriarchy, all of which operate to undermine equity in our relationships to food and therefore society and place itself. And one way to think about food justice practices in the face of gentrification is through different scales of intervention, which I want to end with here today. So at the micro level, newcomers should, at a minimum, learn the history of the cultural foods of longstanding local working class and ethno-racial groups. And this might then inform the practice of patronizing locally owned food businesses of longstanding community members and remaining mindful of the language used to describe such foods in our interpersonal communications and social media feeds. But as the study of alternative food movements makes clear, we cannot simply buy our way out of the problem and act as atomized individuals. So what this suggests is that other scales of intervention are necessary. And at the meso level, it is essential to take the lead from existing food justice and community-based organizations mobilizing against gentrification. These locally rooted organizations are often a base from which to organize and learn to support actually existing locally identified desires. Relatedly, things like community-controlled land trusts can provide both affordable housing and space for urban food production. So one really famous example of this is the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston, Massachusetts, although there are many others. And then at the macro level, it's important that steps are taken to structurally secure the right to the city for working class, Black, Brown, and immigrant communities. And this could entail community benefit agreements for new food retail that mandates pay and benefits that are commensurate with neighborhoods' cost of living, and things like legalizing and protecting food street vending, which many are run by immigrant groups in a lot of different immigrant neighborhoods. Los Angeles, for instance, is an example of a city where such efforts have been underway for many years. And then zoning is another tool that can be used to preserve local food businesses and encourage new long-term resident-run food businesses, as well as mandate that mixed-use developments integrate food retail that meets community needs. And then if we were to think more strategically in the United States, where there are conversations around the Green New Deal, any Green New Deal needs to integrate housing-based statutes that link environmental justice and food justice together to ensure a more widespread right to the city. So while not comprehensive, These are some concrete ideas to begin resisting food gentrification. So in closing, the ongoing forms of food gentrification suggest one more site to reimagine and recreate food and social systems. Especially as more people move to cities, the question of how society provisions itself is incredibly important. It requires changing acceptable practice and challenging the underlying logics of extraction and exploitation. So, will our cities be sites of rampant inequality where the wealthy eat well and own land at the expense of others? Or will they be places where land and resources are equitably distributed and we learn to share and engage across difference? If we have managed to gentrify our cities, then we can ungentrify them as well. Thanks.
So have you been involved, Joshua, in some of these initiatives to food justice yourself?
As it pertains to gentrification,
Yes, yes.
yeah, one of the initiatives, and this is more internal to where I'm located at Colorado State University, have been a lot of conversations about a redevelopment that the university is part of in the Elyria Swansea Globeville neighborhood, which is a historically Latinx neighborhood, an immigrant neighborhood. And this new redevelopment project is going to host a campus of sort for the university. And the idea is to create a site for learning about the history of food and food systems and water systems in Colorado. But it's raised a lot of concerns about increasing gentrification in that same neighborhood and not actually including the interests and concerns of local residents. And so, myself and others have really been pushing internally to encourage both greater reflexivity about the process and also creating actual economic opportunities that allow communities to afford to stay in place, especially as the city continues to support gentrification, as I think was pretty clear from my urban agriculture example. But that's one kind of current case that I'm following and involved with and hoping for a resolution. But I think, as we'll probably talk further in questions, it can be really difficult to slow gentrification.
Yes, I'm sure. We've got quite a few questions have come in. Corrie Wren from the University of Kent said, "Hi Josh, so glad to attend this talk. Notice that veganism isn't really mentioned, although animals are arguably the most oppressed in our food system. I've not lived in something Collins many years. How has the vegan movement evolved?"
I don't follow the vegan movement really closely, but interestingly, I guess I'll tie that back to gentrification for a moment. And one of the interesting trends to observe as it pertains to alternative food spaces is the increasing focus on plant-based diets, which we could argue is important for all kinds of reasons. Interestingly, veganism itself is also coded oftentimes as white and coded as elite and privileged. And a lot of vegan restaurants open up in gentrifying neighborhoods and themselves contribute to gentrification. And I've seen that in Denver, and I've seen that in other neighborhoods and cities that I've lived in around the country. It's almost like if there's not a vegan option, then you're not appealing to the tastes of a lot of gentrifiers who hold those kinds of values. And so it's really contradictory, because on the one hand, that desire to uplift animal rights, uplift the environment, uplift workers who are often exploited alongside the slaughter of animals at the food retail space, and at the point at which that meets these gentrification processes, veganism itself can be entangled in that process. And so, my call is for much greater reflexivity about being vegan, or being a local food activist, or being a farm to table supporter, or buying your food at the local farmers market. or growing at a community garden, I think is really critical to take a step back and look more closely at what we're doing.
Thank you. Melanie Kasparian, she says, thank you so much for this captivating presentation. I was wondering about the literary representations of this process of gentrification, especially in the US. Are you aware of any sources that might be relevant?
Yeah, so I guess literary, I'm going to take broadly for a moment. There's a really fascinating and humorous Netflix series called Gentified. Gente is like people in Spanish, and it takes place in, I believe, Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, and it tells the story of a family that's working to keep their taqueria alive in the face of gentrification pressures. And it gets a lot into the cultural and economic dimensions of gentrification. It also gets a lot into questions of racial inequality, white privilege, and the kind of challenges of navigating from the point of, say, an immigrant-run restaurant, how best to tailor what it is you cook and who you cook for. And so it's this really wonderful, more film representation of gentrification.
Brilliant. Thank you. Pascal Penn, thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. I learned so much. Is there a possibility of culinary resistance for immigrant communities? What does that look like?
That's a great question. And Gentified gets into that a little bit, interestingly enough. Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the examples that immediately comes to mind it has been the fight in Los Angeles to support street vendors. And a lot of them are food street vendors, and many of them are immigrants from Mexico and Central America. And for many years, until very recently, street food vending was illegal. And so it became this sort of struggle over who has a right to the sidewalk, and who has the right to the city, and who has a right to sell food to support their local community. And the contradictory piece, and other people have written on this, people like Nina Martin, who's a geographer, have written about the contradiction between how food trucks, many of them, historically really emerge out of immigrant communities to support local immigrant neighborhoods and ethnic enclaves of various kinds, have become sort of hipsterized, if you will. And while you have sort of the spread of food trucks, you have the marginalization of street food vending at the same time, and the criminalization of immigrant groups at the exact same time. And so the street vending has really been this site for culinary resistance, to use your term. And it's, sort of a site of resistance in many cities around the US, and I imagine elsewhere too. I'm just more familiar with the US context, but I think in places like Chicago as well, where immigrants are essentially fighting back to say, well, we have a right to sell our food here as well. And it shouldn't just be, white people that, are selling kale smoothies that get to have a food truck. Mm-hmm. So that's one example. But, there's also sort of this question of if there are tastes of people entering a community that say, want to eat tacos or want pho or something of that sort, that those long-standing immigrant food restaurants should be able to make modifications to sell to people in those neighborhoods, and do so both as a means of economic survival, but also as a means of sharing their cultural foodways. So resistance can look different in different kinds of ways and contexts, and I think sort of remaining open-minded to the heterogeneity of that is really important.
Thank you. I've got two more questions that came in at exactly the same time by the looks of it. So Isabel asked, what's the role of supermarkets in gentrification processes? In the UK, there have been campaigns resisting new branches because of their impact on small artisanal food businesses. However, others in the same community welcome a new supermarket because it increases access to a wider variety, more affordable foods. Is there a similar contradiction in the US context?
Yeah, there is. And, there are examples of where um, I know there's a case in Portland, for example, in a historically Black neighborhood in Portland where a Whole Foods came in, and a lot of the Black community was concerned that the creation of that Whole Foods, while increasing food access, also served this sort of cultural role of signaling that this was a place for other kinds of people and other kinds of tastes, to be able to buy groceries. And so these kinds of grocery stores can become flashpoints for organizing. Alternatively, and this is why I brought up, as a solution, things like community benefits agreements. These are oftentimes pushed for by community-based groups to strike a legally enforceable contract with a retailer that wants to enter into that community, to legally guarantee that they hire local residents, that they pay, say, living wages and provide healthcare benefits. I mean, the stipulations can just be whatever it is that the community is fighting for. But one of the overarching questions that I often come back to when it comes to grocery stores is the grocery store going to provide an ability for people to actually stay in that community and provide good food? What I've written about with, Justin Myers, what we refer to as good food, good jobs. And so I think it's really critical that grocery stores provide good food and good jobs, and that we don't view this as mutually exclusive, especially in the context of gentrification, where oftentimes the food is also unaffordable, right? So then there's the question of affordability in food, and how do you ensure through, say, zoning, um, that food is affordable? And it gets really tricky because a lot of sort of pro-market forces would say, well, you're intervening in the private sphere and our ability to make money, and so it's really complicated about how you go about challenging these really large corporations, that have a lot of sway, because they also bring tax dollars into cities that need that as well just to operate. And so this is where sort of the growth machine that I was referring to earlier, will oftentimes encourage these kinds of grocery retail, and oftentimes, ironically, at the cost of displacing the exact people that are supposedly going to have an increased access to healthy and affordable food.
Thank you. I've got one last question. We're nearly out of time, but Rebecca O'Connell said, thanks so much for your great talk, Joshua. In our Learning this term, we touched on the question of appropriation that I think is linked with that of gentrification. We reflected on Crescendo Ray's observation that critical food/race studies raises really good questions about cultural appropriation, but is less good at finding solutions. How can we appreciate the food of the other without appropriating it?
What a wonderful question. And I wish it was an easy answer. Yeah, it's a really thoughtful question. And, it's one of those things where maybe you know it when you see it. Maybe that's sort of a wishy-washy answer. But, one thing that I often think about is, cooking from home. And this is different than going out to purchase food. But, I cook a lot of foods from all parts of the world, not all parts of the world, but a lot of parts of the world. And I enjoy that process of learning about food through making it myself. And I think for others, they learn about food and learn about culture and history through eating that and visiting restaurants and, reading about others' foods that are different than themselves. And I think that that's important to do. It's important to eat that food if that's something that's desirable for you. And I guess the other thing that I would just add is, in many places you would be supporting local, longtime resident businesses. The issue becomes one where you start to have people from other backgrounds making and selling food that a group, say, a group who lived in a neighborhood was displaced for making, say, decades prior, right? So all of a sudden, like hipsterized tacos when, you know, the local taqueria is no longer there and nobody's buying food there. And so, you know, a Nigerian chef who's worked in many places around the US named Tunde Wei, he wrote a piece called Whatever Where USA. And he essentially makes the argument in this piece that it's about who owns land and who owns food retail spaces. And that's the crux of all of this, is ownership. And unfortunately, like, the process of cultural appropriation oftentimes has the unintended cultural effect of economically supporting, say, newcomers who are starting new, more hipster kinds of interpretations of, say, Nashville hot chicken, as opposed to those Black restaurants that have been making Nashville hot chicken forever and ever and ever, but aren't getting the street cred, and then therefore are losing out on food business and having to close and losing ownership as a result, like quite literally, of the material conditions of the neighborhood itself. So yeah, that's a little bit about what I think about when you kind of pose that question, but it's a wonderful question. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's it for now. Yeah. Paul Cleve said, thank you, Josh, for a really interesting and inspiring presentation. I think that echoes all of our thoughts about your talk, Josh. It was great. So thank you ever so much for your time and for sharing all of your knowledge and expertise about these really interesting and important, I think, really important topics that we need to address at every level. And I'm intrigued about your cooking, actually. I'm thinking, oh, invite for dinner. Really nice.
If we ever find ourselves together and I have a kitchen, I'm happy to cook.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.